this channel, I like to have the most eclectic range of topics so that everyone can find at least something that they're interested in. And today I've got something special just for you Yanks and Canucks, because I'm looking at some of Yorkshire's explorers, emigrants and pilgrim fathers to America and Canada. So with that in mind, let's look at this part of Yorkshire's hidden history. Churches, banners, kings and queens, factories and big machines, castles, forts and in-betweens are stories that are told. Let's start with a man called Martin Frobisher, whose life was so exciting you could write a whole book about him, but I've just selected a few stories. In 1576, he went on an expedition to discover the Northwest Passage in Canada, and he ended up landing on Baffin Island. He sent out 5 of his men with a local Inuit guide to explore, but something happened, and we're not sure what, and they ended up being captured and were never seen again. However, local Inuit oral tradition holds that they actually lived peacefully among the Inuits of their own free will for a few years, before dying as they attempted to leave the island on homemade boats. Also on this trip, Frobisher found a mysterious black rock, or an ore, which he thought contained gold, and he was really excited about this possibility of new wealth and being incredibly rich, and so he got lots of funding to go on another expedition. He dug up 200 tons of it, and there he was thinking, oh, I'm going to get so rich and impress Queen Elizabeth, only to find out when he returned to England that it was actually fool's gold, which is completely worthless, so he made a bit of a mug out of himself, and the whole saga sounds like something from a Blackadder episode. Moving on, William Bradford is one of the most important people in the history of the Plymouth Pilgrim colony. He was governor of it for about 30 years, and he wrote perhaps the most important contemporary account of the Mayflower voyage and the colony's history. Now, he was born in Austerfield in Yorkshire, and in his early life he became a bit of a religious radical. He believed that the Church of England was still too Catholic, and with his friend William Brewster, who was another important pilgrim, they both attended secret religious meetings at Scrooby Hall in Derbyshire, which is very, very close to the Yorkshire border. However, King James I didn't like that, and as a result they were both arrested for religious disobedience. As a result, they and many others fled to Holland, because at the time Holland was a very, very tolerant place if you were a Protestant nonconformist in 17th century England. They arrived in Holland in 1608, and after a few years they decided to form a colony in America. And so in 1620, on the Dutch ship Speedwell, they sailed alongside the Mayflower to found the most important English colony in America since Jamestown. And the rest, they say, is history. Now, obviously there's lots and lots of individual stories which I don't have time to tell, but my favourite is in 1638 when the Reverend Ezekiel Rogers left the village of Rowley in East Yorkshire with a few families to start a new village of Rowley in Massachusetts. Now, this is because he was a Puritan reverend and he was fired from his job after he refused to read from the Church of England's Book of Sports. This was just a declaration of what sports and games you were allowed to play on Sundays, but him being a Puritan was like, no fun allowed, this is disgraceful, you shall not be allowed to have fun or play games on Sundays, and in apoplectic fury he refused to read from the book and was as such fired. He and a few families left to find a new life in the New World, and in 1638 landed in New England on the ship John of London, which by the way carried the first ever printing press in the United States. Let's move to Canada for a bit. Now, perhaps one of the biggest single concentrations of Yorkshire emigrants is in Nova Scotia in Canada, where between 1772 and 1775, around 1,000 people from Yorkshire and elsewhere settled in the area. Now, this is really interesting because it gives us a window into the social and economic history of Yorkshire at the time. See, this is the Industrial Revolution, and it's the era of land enclosures, and this is where farming, which used to be fairly open and communal, was now completely transformed. Landowners were now allowed to chop up this communal land into private farms, and although it did increase productivity, it decimated the peasant class. It often became so expensive now to rent farms that people couldn't be farmers anymore. They had to leave and go to big cities to find work, which utterly transformed the social landscape. Yorkshire had some of the highest rates of land enclosure in England, and it's no coincidence that the two highest rates areas, North and East Yorkshire, were also the areas where most people who went to Nova Scotia came from. We have contemporary documents which show when people were asked why they left, they said they wanted to find a better life, to escape from the high rents, and it really gives us an insight into the motivations of people who would leave everything behind, never seeing Yorkshire again, to go to this strange, weird land in the hope of a new and better future. Finally, let's end with Captain James Cook. Because although we know him mostly for his oceanic explorations, and by the way he wasn't eaten, he also had a number of contributions to Canadian history too. In the Royal Navy he was involved extensively in the 7 Years' War, and he was involved in a lot of major battles, including the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, in which the British basically won because he mapped to the St. Lawrence River. But by far his most important contribution was in mapping Newfoundland, and the success and skill with which he did this drew him lots of praise and attention, and eventually funded his oceanic explorations. And the rest, they say, is history. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you've learnt something new.